So we are Coping Live Talk, and we are live for the 110th time. That's how old we are now, but it does not mean we are old. We just simply gained experience in the last 2 years, and I appreciate Candy, Sheehan, and Scott Kiddle for being with us so faithfully every Saturday, week after week, helping people to learn about how to cope in this time of uncertainty, time of stress, and also time of sometimes having bad habits. And that's why today I invite you to meet Kristy Killcup, who will be sharing with us about how to break our bad habits. And we have plenty of them. And sometimes we do not know that we live in self-deception. Am I right, Kristy?
Yes, absolutely right.
So welcome to our Coping Live Talk podcast. And let's start with your introduction. So who are you? Where are you from? And also expressing our warm regards from everybody in our audience who will be watching us today. Welcome.
Thank you. So my name is Kristy Killcup. I'm the founder, CEO, and transformation coach of Version of You 2.0. I'm a self-professed expert on self-sabotage, and I live in Canada.
You live in Canada, wonderful. And we had been in Canada, in Montreal. So that's a beautiful, beautiful country. So welcome again, and please let's begin the conversation about self-sabotage, because people have, I think, sometimes a misconception. Even if you think about self-sabotage, what do you think, Candy and Scott, about?
It's I think for my own self, sometimes I do things that aren't in my best interest, and I don't really realize it until maybe I've done it, and then I'm disappointed in myself. But I'm really anxious to hear what Kristy has to say.
And that's exactly what we will be talking today about. So we will be talking about what is self-sabotage. Then we will talk about common self-sabotaging behaviors and what are the three main mistakes we make. I would love to know them, honestly. So three main mistakes you make. So Kristy, let's begin with the definition. What is self-sabotage?
Yeah, so let me just be really clear that this definition is my definition, what self-sabotage really means for me. And for me, it's our conscious or unconscious set of barriers that really keeps us from moving forward. So simply put, we knowingly or unknowingly, which is kind of what Candy alluded to, sabotage ourselves, but it's out of the fear of the unknown. So you see, we're masters of our own demise. We are our best con artists. And you're going to hear me say that again later. There's no person on this planet who can destroy us the way that we can destroy us. And I know that that sounds really intense, but I mean, that's the truth. We stand in our own way. Nobody else does that. Nobody controls our thoughts, our feelings, our actions. Only we do. And it's basically the ways in which we sabotage ourselves really come in the form of different personas, which we'll get into. And I like to call that the usual suspects.
Wow. So Scott, does it match your definition of self-sabotage?
Can't hear you.
Oh, okay. While Scott is tuning his sound, can you try again? Oh, okay. So he will be working on his mic settings, and but so Candy, what do you think about this definition?
Yeah, I think that you are sometimes your own worst enemy. And, I think that I can relate to that. I know that's true. I often put limits or expectations on myself that nobody else has. So it's more about me than it is about what is expected. So I appreciate that.
And our perception, right? It's like
Yes.
we put these limitations on ourselves based on a perception, not based on what the actual reality is, because we haven't experienced that reality yet.
So that tells me again that we are self-deceiving ourselves a lot.
Yes.
But then we have a tendency, of course, not to blame ourselves, but blaming is another probably angle of self-sabotaging, right? But we do not take sometimes responsibility for doing this to ourselves. Is it correct?
Yeah, actually, or the opposite, where we take on too much responsibility. And one of those is like our punish, like one of the usual suspects, one of our self-sabotaging behaviors is that we actually punish ourselves, where we take ownership, even though in some cases somebody else's actions, but we assume we're responsible for that. And that really comes down to the fact that we lack this sense of self-worth.
Very interesting. Okay, so let's continue on that topic of self-sabotaging because the topic for today is breaking bad habits. So it sounds to me from this title that it is so engraved in us. Where does it start and when?
Yeah, so I think as we start to figure out where we fit in the world, we have this need for love, belonging, and safety. And when we're children growing up, we create these internal rules or these distorted truths as what creates love, safety, and belonging. And as a result of that, in creating these distorted truths, we come up with coping mechanisms to address gaps in our level of awareness, gaps because we're not able to walk away from a dangerous situation. So we come up with other tactics. And I mean, it really does start when we're young, but I think we really start to notice how it's become ingrained in us as adults when we're truly capable of walking away from a situation, of voicing our opinion, of financial stability, but then we're not able to leverage all of those skill sets. And we kind of defer back to old coping mechanisms, despite the fact that we can walk away from a situation. So let me just quickly get into some of the usual suspects just to see if any of you, and obviously your listeners, resonate with any of these. And I won't go into too many of them, but just a couple, just to see if these make sense for some of you. So one of them is priority issues. And this tends to be one that I see a lot with my clientele. I work with women who struggle with taking back control of their health when they're trying to lose weight. And one of their main struggles, one of their default patterns is they prioritize everybody else's needs above their own. And this is usually rooted in the distorted belief about their own self-worth. Now, priority issues, however, also comes up in other ways. And I see this sometimes with my clients where they're newly separated, widowed, or divorced, or even in my clients who are moms who've just spent years and years and years prioritizing their family over their own needs, that they really just don't know what it is that they want. So as a result of that, they avoid addressing their own needs and they just focus on the needs of their family. And often with people with priority issues, they justify their behavior. So I don't know if you've heard this before, if you've said this yourself, but it's like we say, oh, you know what? I'm just too busy to take care of me, whatever that too busy might be, but I'm just too busy. And the other one that I hear often is, I just don't know what to do to make myself a priority. And in saying, I just don't know what to do, it really just means that we don't really know what we want in order to make ourselves a priority. Now, another one that really goes hand in hand with priority issues is boundary issues. This direct relationship really has this underlying root cause of lack of self-worth. And this is where people demonstrate a sense of selflessness, but to the point where it's to the detriment of their own health and personal well-being. So with boundary issues, the main desire is to ensure that the needs and expectations of others is met. And the typical justification here is, I just didn't want to disappoint, right? Now, this is the one that I was talking about earlier, that I alluded to earlier, that you had asked the question about. And this is the punish reward behavior. So I see this all the time with food and exercise, where, if we didn't exercise enough, we'll punish ourselves by not taking in enough food. So we'll go into a caloric deficit that just doesn't make sense for the body. But we also see this in other ways too, where we can punish ourselves through distorting our appearance, through tattoos and piercings. I don't know if any of you have ever done this, but when I was growing up, when I was in elementary school and high school, a couple of times when, I was in a relationship with somebody and that relationship ended, I cut my own bangs. And I knew that I shouldn't cut my bangs. And it sounds kind of silly, but the thing is I did it because I was trying to distort the way I looked, because I wasn't happy with the situation in my personal life. And I was somehow punishing myself by making myself look differently. And that is actually something that, when I talk about, a lot of my clients will go, oh my gosh, I've done that too, and I knew I shouldn't have done it, but I just needed to change something. I just needed to like punish myself, in some way. But we also do this with implants, promiscuous behavior, a willingness to put ourselves in harm's way, even though we know we shouldn't, and then self-harm, such as cutting and over-the-counter drug use. So what ends up happening is we attempt to punish ourselves because we've somehow perceived that we've stepped out of line, or that we willfully disobeyed our own rules and self-imposed expectations, or we disobeyed the rules made by others who we feel are in positions of authority or influence. Now, the reward behavior is tied really closely to punishment behavior, but with the reward behavior, this is where we tend to see, the overconsumption of alcohol or eating, because we'll say to ourselves, I've been really good this week. Like, you might see this when you've been restricting your eating, when you're dieting, I've been really good this week, so I'm going to go ahead and have the piece of cake. But then that ends up turning into overindulging, right? We don't just stop after the one piece of cake, we go back for more, or, we consume a second drink, a third drink, or a fourth drink. Now, quickly, and I won't go into these, but there are others like resistance, where we have this resistance to being happy. Unfamiliarity, where when we start to move beyond our comfort zone, when we actually start to do all of the things that we want to do and start moving in that forward direction, we either consciously or unconsciously sabotage ourselves in order to take steps back, to move us back into what's familiar, so that we can kind of say to ourselves, see, it doesn't work. I'm not supposed to have that. Or, I'm not supposed to lose this weight and keep it off permanently. Other ones are detachment, perfectionism, and indecisiveness. I'm a recovering perfectionist. And of course, deflection and dismissing a problem. But what I'm trying to say here, and I'll end it right here, is that what I need you to understand from our sabotaging behaviors is that these were really ways that allowed us to avoid dealing with, the fear of the unknown, the fear of losing control of a situation, all of the what ifs about the future, but then also the fear of being afraid of being rejected, being humiliated, or ashamed. So it's really that avoidance tactic that we use because we don't know how to respond and deal with our own feelings.
Interesting. So I want to stop at one point that you made about being too busy, doing too much. So that means to me, did I hear you right, that doing too much is in a way also a self-sabotage?
Oh my gosh, yes, absolutely. Remember, when we're doing stuff that's not in alignment with what we really want, then we're moving away from what we want. We are choosing to, whether we know that we're doing it or not, we are making a decision, consciously or unconsciously, moving us away from what it is that we want. And certainly overworking ourselves is one of the things that we do. And typically when we overwork, when we become workaholics, it is this sense of really striving to be this high performer so that we can showcase our worth to others. But oftentimes it comes at the detriment of our own health and the detriment of our family. And when you ask a workaholic, why are they working so hard? They say is because they want to support their family. But, they're no longer able to do that because they're not around. They're just financially supporting the family.
And it also seems like to me it's counter intuitive, because last Sunday I talked to my congregation about having a not to-do list instead of to-do list. I mean, to-do list you cannot avoid, you have it. But sometimes we make it so swollen, so long, that in a way it's very discouraging. But it makes us feel like I'm doing something, right?
Yeah.
But so I found out for myself that not to do list is short, but it also like very instructive and like a commandment. And if you follow that, you actually release lots of time to do what you like to do. So if you approach your concept of self-sabotage, can you kind of improvise right away, since our coping life talk is very improvisational and casual. So what will you personally put on not to-do list?
Oh, so not only am I a recovering perfectionist, but I'm a recovering procrastinator. And actually, when you talked about the big to-do list, what ends up happening for me is I'll create the to-do list, I'll get overwhelmed by it, and then I'll procrastinate and not do anything, which leads to more overwhelm.
Yeah.
Right?
Okay.
So in not having a to-do list, or at least in choosing 1 to 2 things that maybe I don't really want to do them, but I know that if I get them done, I'll just feel so much better. So an easy example is putting laundry away. I will do all of the laundry. I will fold it all and I'll put it in my laundry basket. But then my laundry basket will stay in my room. And as embarrassing as that is to admit, if I just said, put your clothes away, they're clean, they're all folded nicely. It's like maybe 20 minutes, if that, to put all my clothes away, hang them up, put them in the drawers. But when I've done that, I've inspired myself now to go ahead and do something else, because that's something that in my mind, for whatever reason, is kind of a blockage. It's something I don't like to do. I don't want to do it. Doesn't take a lot of time. But if I do it, all of a sudden I'm like, oh, I feel so good, and it just motivates me to want to go ahead and do other things. That's what I would
Absolutely.
put on my not to-do list, is just those 1 or 2 little things.
Thank you.
One thing I wondered about, Kristy, is when you were talking about priorities, I just struggle with setting priorities. And I have trouble deciding, well, what's the most important thing to do?
Fair.
And I just don't know that I've ever gotten that right. I was on a kick for a week of walking and exercising every day. And, that's a great thing to do. But I found out it made me so tired, I didn't want to do anything else. So today I didn't walk or exercise. And I made about 5 stops doing errands that I really kind of needed to get done. And so I just seem like I get caught in this, I don't know what it is, this cycle of having trouble deciding, what is the important thing to do. And if you asked me to do something, Kristy, you could ask me anything. If I didn't have anything else on my calendar, I'd probably say, oh, sure, I can do that. And I know that's not the right thing to do, but I don't know how to change. What would you say about that? What advice?
So it sounds like there's 2 components here. It sounds like one is consistency. And correct me if I'm wrong, right? We've only had a very quick conversation here,
Sure.
But I would want to coach you to find out more about consistency in terms of, how are you staying on track? Because I know that you'd said that it was a newer activity that you'd started, but it was making you tired. So I'd want to talk to you about consistency. And the other one would be, I don't know if it's so much in creating the priority, like putting this particular activity as a main priority for you, but it almost sounds like we would want to take a look at more of a baby step approach. Like, what would be the minimal effective dose, if you will, for you to feel like you made yourself a priority? So sometimes some of my clients will say to me, I set my alarm every morning really early, but then when the alarm goes off, I turn it off and roll over in bed, and then by the time I get up, it's too late to go to the gym. So my response to them would be, okay, well, what's the the minimal effective dose. Do you have 15 minutes that once you've realized that you actually have to get out of bed to stretch, where maybe you're not going to the gym, but you're doing something that's still in alignment with your health goals. So maybe you're stretching, maybe you did a meditation, a 15-minute meditation. Maybe you did go for a walk and you just took, your dog around the block, like whatever it is that at least makes you feel like you've done something for you. Maybe it is making yourself a cup of coffee or tea and sitting outside and just watching the sunrise. And it has nothing to do with physically moving, but it's still this whole mental health and mental reprieve that you're giving yourself before starting your day.
Okay.
So Scott, I know that you tried to say something, the microphone did not work, so let's hear your opinion.
Well, so when you were talking about procrastination, it's funny that you brought that up because Lydia and I had a conversation about that just this morning. And I think we made 3 observations. I can only recall 2 at the moment. Maybe Lydia, you remember the other. But one of the first observations that I made was that procrastination can be connected to perfectionism.
Yep.
I'm not going to start this until I know that I can really knock it out of the park, that I can execute a level of excellence that I'm going to be satisfied with. And then the second thing that I've believed for years is that if I feel like that I'm not in control of much of my life, if I tell myself, okay, I'm going to put this task off till tomorrow, I have exercised, I'm thinking in my own mind that I have control over my time. But yet I'm self-sabotaging because that thing just never gets done.
Right.
And then there's going to be external forces that hold me accountable, right?
So it's a coping mechanism, right? So it started with this fear of lack of control. So then you created control, but in the end, it's still a lack of control because you haven't addressed the underlying issue. And it's just this constant cycle until we address the underlying issue, whatever that may be. We have to reconcile it. If we don't reconcile it, then we're just going to continue to find other ways to avoid dealing with it.
Yeah, makes sense. Lydia, do you remember the third observation or no?
We talked about, I don't think we discussed it this morning, but procrastination also generates a sense of excitement. And it's kind of like a drug. It's like addiction to this extra energy that somehow appears from nowhere if you have only 2 hours before you turn in your paper. And so, right? And so then this adrenaline is what we are craving. And so instead of starting the job and doing it incrementally or project or paper, then we simply wait till the very last moment and then we run and we perform well. But it's very self-destructive, I think. So is it a form of self-sabotage?
Yeah. Being addicted to stress is actually something people will create stress in their life. I don't know if you know anybody where they just constantly seem to attract, like problems, or they create problems where you're like, but if you really thought about it, it's not as big of a deal as you're making it out to be. Dr. Joe Dispenza, he talks about that a lot, where he says exactly what you just described, where we can get really addicted to stress. And it's not even so much our mind does, but our body does. Have you ever relaxed to then notice all of a sudden you have this like anxiety come on, or you're finally starting to fall asleep, and then all of a sudden you start to go into this ruminating thought cycle of, I call it solving world peace, where you just can't get out of this thought process, but you were super calm and there was no reason for you to get triggered in this way to start this ruminating thought pattern, and yet it happens. Well, our body, does get into this need to feel stress, and it is an addiction for sure, and it is a self-sabotaging behavior.
It
I
is
seem
an
to
interest.
recall. Oh, I was just going to say, I seem to recall. Sorry to interrupt. I recall a phrase that I heard many years ago, drama queen, to describe. Well, I think what you have alluded to. Is that a familiar term?
Trauma queen?
No, drama.
Yes, drama queen. Oh, for sure.
Yeah.
Sometimes that's really because they don't know how else to gain. That really comes from like a place of belonging. You know, kids do this when they're young, where they learn to create attention by being rebellious or by suggesting that they're sick or hurt, and they kind of overplay that a little bit in order to gain attention. Drama queen, to me, still has that same sense of there's this need for them to belong. And so they're going to go ahead and do things in order to create attention. Negative or positive is irrelevant. It's attention. Yeah. But I do think that when people are addicted to stress, absolutely, they're constantly living in this sense of drama. And, you know, whether it be for attention or whether it be just simply because they don't know how to live a life that has this lower level stress or bouts of no stress, that they just create it.
Yeah. You mentioned something about how when we relax, we suddenly start feeling this anxiety. So I want us to, I found this a wonderful quote from Maureen Brady. She says, sometimes we self-sabotage just when things are seem to be going too smooth. And I was like, gosh, that is just amazing. That is kind of counterintuitive. We want, don't you think, Candy and Scott, we want to have a smooth life, no troubles. Trust Kristy, we are not drama queens, aren't we? We are not, because we don't intentionally look for trouble. But it's very true. When you just sit down and suddenly like, oh, you know, and that's what I want to show it again on the screen, this quote that she says at the end, perhaps this is a way to express our fear about whether it is okay for us to have a better life. It's stunning to me. It's so counterintuitive. So could you elaborate a little on that?
I think that's so true. I agree with that, because that is, things are just going so well. You just know something's going to happen. And then you start to get anxious or afraid of when is it going to happen? I know it's just around the corner. And then you just make it worse, for sure.
There's this sense of deservability. Do I deserve to be happy? And then there's this sense of unfamiliarity. I'm not familiar with what it's like to actually have this happy life. I'm not familiar with what it's like to be in a stable relationship. When's the shoe gonna drop?
Yeah.
Right?
Right.
Yeah.
Oh, that is scary. What we do to ourselves.
So here's the 3 common mistakes.
Okay.
The first one is we trust the con artist mind. And I kind of mentioned that earlier about pay attention to that, because we will accept the rationalizations, the justifications, the excuses that we come up with in our own minds as truth, even if it means keeping us in the status quo. So how many times have you talked yourself out of doing something that you know was good for you?
Oh, absolutely. Candy, did you have experiences like that?
Absolutely.
How about you, Scott?
I'm going to have to think about that one a little bit, but I'm sure there's some wisdom there.
Well,
but you,
even the
for example,
procrastinating tactics, like whenever we procrastinate from doing something that we want, you know, I'll do it later. But if we did it now, we would enjoy the benefits of it in having done it right now, but we're choosing to delay that reward.
But so tell me, does it apply to this example? For example, for instance, if a person is a little depressed, feels lonely, knows she or he knows well that to help himself or herself, she or he needs to get out, needs to join maybe even simply a church or a certain nonprofit organization, or just when friends invite me over. I remember at one point I was so depressed, lost so much in my life, and I remember my friends will call me, Lydia, we are having a party, join us. I will say thank you so much, but I'm very busy. Or for example, but then I feel very lonely. Then I feel like I have no friends, you see? So, or for example, I remember I got a card from my friend who tried to invite me like maybe 5-7 times, and I was always busy. And then she wrote me a card, Lydia, we're having this extremely interesting guest, and we want you to come and share your experience. And I felt like I was cornered. And I thought, no, I don't want to get out of the house because I need to preserve my sense of sadness. I deserve to be sad, I want, but then I get upset that I don't have friends. I don't have people around me. So is it self-sabotaging one of the mistakes we make?
Yeah, I mean, you just talked about it, that sense of deservability. I don't deserve to be happy, so why would I put myself in positions where I can be happy? There's also, remember, self-sabotage is also an avoidance tactic. They become negative coping mechanisms. So we tend to isolate ourselves when we feel like we're not deserving to be happy, or when we feel like we're not quite ourselves when we go out. Like, you're more vulnerable when you're around other people. And when we have this feeling of a lack of self-worth, this sense of vulnerability is really high. You go out and you spend time with other people, and you feel this need to protect yourself from being vulnerable, because if you exposed yourself, then they were going to know who you really were, and then they weren't going to like you. Right? These are all kind of the ways in which we talk to ourselves. We've got this con artist in our mind that justifies, seclusion and isolation over connection, because we're afraid of being vulnerable. We believe that we're not good enough as we are, and that other people are gonna all of a sudden see that as truth and be like, oh, Kristy, you're not worth my time. I don't want to spend time with you. So then I'll just stay home and avoid being rejected.
I want to challenge you here for a second, because you mentioned the word seclusion. And when it comes to, let's say, a person is depressed, that's one thing. But also seclusion is recommended for mindfulness. So, for example, religious practices, right? So, like, since I'm a minister, I believed that, oh no, I need to be by myself. I need to spend more time alone. And then, in a way, what I think I created, at the same time, I know that I'm much happier around people. And God does not want us to be lonely and be kind of in that seclusion. Though people will argue, like, what about monasteries? That was important. But those were communities. You see, that's what we forget. And so in a way, we resist being happy. And we resist other people's invitations who know that together is what we are. I mean, we people are created to be in community, right? So that's resistance is also self-sabotage, correct? Yeah. So you mentioned resistance even to be happy. Why is that?
Because we grew up believing, again, these distorted truths where, we weren't entitled to be happy. Happiness was for other people. It wasn't, for me. So, for example, and this is not my self-sabotaging behavior, but some of my clients have said, I'm never going to have another relationship. The first relationship I had ended in divorce. Being in a solid marriage is just not available to me. And that's the resistance, is this belief system, because of experience, that we don't have this deservability to be happy, that it's for other people, but it's just not meant for me.
How about trust? Because, for example, you talk about divorce, you talk about unfortunate relationship, a breakup, and then the trust is damaged. So is it also self-sabotage that we resist to trust?
Oh, yeah, because that's vulnerability, right? When we trust, we become vulnerable. We expose ourselves to the potential of the unknown, you know, again, and I'll refer this back to relationships because this is where I see it the most, where when you put yourself out there and you try and connect with somebody else, you're essentially opening yourself up to rejection and humiliation. And those are really big feelings that we don't typically like to feel. We've felt them in the past. We've got this attachment to these feelings. And when we make ourselves vulnerable, we're putting ourselves in harm's way of, you know, being embarrassed or being rejected. So we hold back from that, and we will do a lot of different things to avoid being vulnerable. And this was actually one of mine, where if I shared with you a vulnerability, if I said to you that I expressed myself where what I was saying to you was important to me, if I felt like you were dismissing me, I would react by just lashing out. And that was my self-sabotaging behavior. And when I finally had a chance to understand what that was about, that was because all of a sudden I felt vulnerable because I'd shared something with you. I felt like you dismissed me and therefore you were rejecting me. And it wasn't safe for me to be vulnerable anymore. So because it wasn't safe for me to be vulnerable, the part of me that lashed out was trying to protect me. Does that make sense?
Yes, absolutely. So it's go ahead, Scott.
So when you talk about allowing yourself to trust others and to be vulnerable, some folks have a habit of connecting with the wrong kind of people, with toxic people. They just keep going back into that same kind of relationship. Is that connected to this deservability question?
I think it's probably connected to a bunch of different behaviors, like codependency. It's what you know. It's what you're familiar with, right? And we talked about familiarity and unfamiliarity. So when you're familiar with something, if you have this behavior where you tend to be really aggressive when you drink, and I see you at a bar and you're drinking and I can see this aggressive behavior in you, if it's something that I grew up with, then I might be familiar with that. And I might not look at that as a negative or a red flag and saying that, you know, maybe you've got some like anger issues that you need to deal with. Instead, I'm going to resonate with that. I'm going to be like, I know that he just needs my help and he's going to be fine. I just need to fix him.
You're the white knight then.
Yeah. Right. But it's because I'm familiar with it. I'm familiar with the behavior. So then I feel like we're on a different level. Like you must be my soulmate because you check off a whole bunch of boxes because I'm familiar with all of those from my past. And so all of a sudden we'll have a conversation and we'll know each other very intimately just simply because of how that relatability that we have. And I'm not going to see those red flags.
And it takes also me to very close to our need to be loved and our need to love. But again, when you talk about three main mistakes we make, one of them is we withhold love. And I think I'm afraid that people withhold love even in families toward their spouses and toward their children or their parents. Could you spend a little time on that? Because I want to post here a quote that says withholding love is a form of self-sabotage, as what we withhold from others, we are withholding from ourselves. Yeah. So how? Let's talk a little about that.
It's what we know, right? If I grew up in a household where my parents did not know how to show their emotions, if they could not be emotionally available to me, then I never learned how to be emotionally available to somebody else. You know, there's this level again of vulnerability attached to that. I could tell my son, I've got a 15-year-old, I could tell my son I love him, But if I'm not able to hug him, if I'm not able to encourage him through, various actions and show my love for him because I'm uncomfortable with that, because I'm not familiar with that, or whatever the reason may be, then that's this feeling, or that's this place of self-sabotage, because I don't know how to do that. And if I can't do that for my child or for my spouse, I'm certainly not going to be showing that for myself. Brene Brown had a really great quote, and I don't know it off by heart, but it's along the lines of, you can't really truly love somebody else if you don't know how to love yourself. Very similar to the quote that you just read. And I firmly believe that to be true. In order to be able to really truly express love to somebody else, you have to know what love is. And that first starts by you knowing how to love yourself and respect yourself.
That is very important. That's just so deep. Okay, Candy, I think you have something.
That was just something that I just so believe also. I see and this may not be something you deal with at all, but in some families, it seems like the love is so conditional. It's dependent upon what the other person does. And I wonder about that, if that's ever justified. It just seems like either you love someone or I did always puzzle over that, and maybe that doesn't fit in our discussion, but what do you think about that?
You know what? This is definitely going to be a touchy subject. So I'm just going to preface that. But I agree with you. I think that sometimes as parents, and again, it's a touchy subject, and I'm acknowledging this, that what I'm going to say is not going to sit well with a lot of people. But there are some parents who have children in an attempt, and it's not, I don't believe that it's conscious, but in an unconscious attempt to do better by them than what they had growing up, right?
Sure.
Right? So thank you. So, but what ends up happening is we try to have them live the lives we want them to live. We want them to follow the rules that we want them to follow versus allowing them to decide for themselves. And having a 15-year-old, so I'm now dealing with a teenager, this is something that my son is trying to teach me as we go, where his life is not by my design. His life is by his design. And it doesn't matter what my childhood experiences were like, what my limiting beliefs are like. I'm not going to control his life, which means I can't manipulate his decisions and decide to reward him with love or take the love away when he doesn't listen. It's right. That's not what we're supposed to do as parents when we're child rearing.
Right.
We love our children unconditionally. They make the decisions that they make, and we're going to be there to support them as much as we possibly can. And yes, our job is to guide them, but not to punish them by manipulating them, to love them sometimes and not love them other times, which is sometimes what happens.
Absolutely. Yeah, that makes sense to me. Thank you.
That behavior, I think, is in my experience, is just so damaging to a child's psyche, right?
Yeah.
And you enter into adulthood in having a big obstacle in your way of having meaningful and joyful relationships.
Well, essentially what you're doing is you're telling your child that they cannot genuinely be them, that they have to be a version of them that everybody else likes in order for them to be loved.
Right.
That makes sense.
Since we talk about breaking bad habits, and it's maybe a lot of off topic, but I remember a story of a man, because I'm very interested in bullying, abuse, family abuse, violence, and this man, who is a mature man now, he shared a story about his father who withdrew his love, like what we are talking about, but also he abused his mother and also abused the boy. And this gentleman shared a story how when the mother needed to go to the store, for example, he will drop her off like about 4 blocks from the grocery store and give her just very little money, and then driving away, making his wife, first of all, walking with the little boy to the store, and then, to make it short, you get the picture that it's abuse, it's neglect. But then, kind of going forward with that story, the mother died, never seen her husband loving her, and the boy now is a very successful businessman, and the father becomes old. You see, the roles reverse. And so what he said, I never forget. He says, we had to take him in, but this is all I could do for him. I never showed him love, just like he did not show to me. And I thought, and so he says, all I could do is to care, but I could not love him. So could you talk about it? How would you diagnose this particular relationship? Is it self-sabotage, that the man deprived himself even in the mature age to experience his father's love, who may be changed, but I don't know. I'm just open to hear what you say.
Yeah. So this is just my opinion. I don't know that it's so much self-sabotage as it is just the relationship didn't exist, right? There was no respect for his father.
Okay.
And he took him in because it was more this sense of responsibility.
Yeah.
But when somebody mistreats you and your mom that way, it's hard to believe that there was this sense of love and respect for his father. So, I mean, he felt like he needed to take responsibility, which I actually don't even know that he needed to have done. But I don't think it's self-sabotage. I think whatever the father's issues were, it really was just a matter of the father needed to be in control and needed to feel this sense of authoritarianism over, the wife and the child, and probably felt really threatened by the wife and child's relationship that they had. And, maybe the father was self-sabotaging himself because he never could have that type of connection with his son that his wife had.
So what I hear clearly is that in this particular story, the father was the one who self-sabotaged him for the rest of his life.
I think the father self-sabotaged himself. Like the father self-sabotaged the father.
Right. Yeah. Right. Right.
By ensuring that he could never have the connection that his wife and son had. But I suspect that because he had a family, the father got married and had a child, that he at some point wanted a connection, but he probably just didn't feel like he deserved it. And so consistently,
or didn't know how.
Right. And consistently did things to prove to himself that he didn't deserve it.
Okay. And also, is it true that, again, since we continue on this topic of parent-child relationship, I've heard many times when children said who were not loved, did not feel much love, did not see much love in the family, but they would say, my mother says I've been treated that way, so I was not loved by my parents, so I'm not going to show you. I don't know how to do that even. So that's
Yeah, I think that's going to be true for all of us to some degree. We all have, what do I refer to this as? I'm trying to think of the words that I use. We all have a certain skill set when it comes to parenting. Right. And capacity, that's what it is. We all have this level of capacity, right? Some people have a higher level of capacity where they can, logically make decisions. They can handle stress. They can emotionally make decisions. They can show vulnerability. They can be empathetic. Other people have lesser of a capacity. They can make logical decisions. They can handle stress, but they don't have the emotional fortitude or skill sets or whatever the case may be, awareness to be able to offer their child all of them. And it really is just the level of capacity that each one of us tries to parent.
So that's again withholding love.
Yeah, but I think in some cases it's because they don't know how to show love.
They don't know
It's
how
not
to show love.
intentional. Yeah, it's they lack the capacity to demonstrate love because they just were never shown how to do it.
Okay. Before we move to the topic that is very interesting to all of us, the topic of forgiveness. Does forgiveness fall in a way when we withhold it as a self-sabotage issue also? But before that, Candy and Scott, do you have any questions about what you just heard about these three main mistakes? Actually, I hear more mistakes than even three, but definitely three main. Could you repeat them, please?
Yeah. So we actually didn't get to the second two. So the first one is we trust our con artist mind. Remember, we will always rationalize getting ourselves back to a place of comfort versus trying to move into this place of discomfort. You know, we will always justify, rationalize, come up with excuses and make them true even when they're not true. You know, why did I do that? Why did I convince myself that I should have done this when now I'm regretting that decision? You know, I'll joke around and I'll say, seemed like a good idea at the time, but, you know, not anymore. Now, the other two are we steer clear of fear. And this is where we play with familiarity and unfamiliarity. But again, to change, we must experience uncertainty, discomfort, and unfamiliarity with what to expect. We have to. To change means to do something differently than what we've done in the past, right? But because we gravitate to familiarity over unfamiliarity, because we are so much more comfortable in our comfort zone, we almost always choose what is familiar. And so this sets us down the road of normalizing mediocrity and complacency. And number three is we live day and night in conflicting thoughts. And this goes back to my example that I gave earlier about the alarm clock, where the night before you're like, yes, I'm going to wake up extra early. I'm going to go to the gym before going to work. I'm going to feel like a rock star. It's going to be amazing, getting back on track. Then the next morning, the alarm clock goes off and you turn it off and roll over in bed because the first thought you had was, it's too early. I'm so cozy. I just want to go back to sleep. Well, the third mistake in that we can't hold conflicting thoughts. The first thought was, you know, I want to get up and exercise. And the second thought was, I want to stay in bed and sleep. And your mind will always choose the path of least resistance.
So the mind.
The three
that does make sense.
Yeah.
Right.
So that's all about our brain, right?
Always, yes.
All this brain, and that's why we have all these issues with self-sabotaging. But you mentioned as a number two, familiarity. Familiarity rules our decisions. And so, for example, when people are very familiar with where they live, they have a job and maybe they don't like it. Maybe they even have new opportunities. But how many times people who have a better offer, they choose to decline it because then they probably the brain is weighing that I am not familiar with this city. I'm not familiar with this job. And then the whole horror picture builds up in our brain, right? So, so that's familiarity you're talking about. So we defeat ourselves, not changing the place of living, not accepting a new job, and maybe even making new friends, because old friends, maybe they are not as good, but they're familiar. But also, go ahead. Yes. All three. Okay. All three. Okay. Yeah. So are you saying that we need to be more open-minded to change?
Yeah, that's exactly what I'm saying. You know what? We need to know when our con artist mind is talking to us. And I'll get into that in our tips on having to address the self-sabotaging.
Okay.
But yeah, we need to know when we're trying to talk ourselves out of doing something. Definitely leaning into fear and using it as a beacon, knowing that, I mean, there's a difference between, you know, where our life is in jeopardy, going down a back alley that doesn't feel safe, that's stressful and that's fearful, and we don't want to just go ahead and walk down the back alley going, I'm going to lean into my beacon of fear, because that's not okay. But when we're deciding that we want to make a decision, and this happens with when clients want to meet me for the first time, we have this call, it's free. They sit and talk to me about what's going on in their world. They decide that they want to work with me, but then they end up, when they're off the phone, they end up getting really worried about what life's going to be like when they actually do change and they actually start living the life that they want. They start to get really fearful, and then they start worrying about what that's going to be like. And when we have the conversation of, well, what are you afraid of? Well, I'm afraid of my life becoming really great.
Right? And also less of stress and too comfortable. Seems like our brain says that, oh no, it's too comfortable, I'm getting anxious. True?
Oh, yeah. And don't forget, we have the conflicting thoughts. I want this. I really, truly want this. And I don't know what it's going to be like to get there, so I'm not going to do it.
Wow.
Yeah.
I don't like that brain.
So we can talk to it.
So how do you talk to your brain? Let's do that.
Okay, so I'm going to take you down a journey, and each point that I'm going to make moves into the next point, okay? So there's 4 tips, but it's going to take me a couple of minutes to go through.
Okay, go ahead. We are ready to learn.
Okay. Tip number 1 is you need to gain perspective. And you really need to ask yourself, what am I feeling? So remember, when we self-sabotage ourselves, that's because we feel like we're under threat in some way. We're afraid of not having control of something, or we're afraid of reliving emotions of shame, regret, guilt, whatever that may be. But when we start to sensitize ourselves to how our body is feeling, when we become more sensitive to our physiology, it'll be easier for us to recognize that we've been triggered, which is what happens before we sabotage ourselves. Okay? So step number 1 is to gain perspective and go, okay, what am I feeling? I think I'm feeling triggered right now. So that's step number 1. Step number 2 is once you've recognized that your cheeks are getting flushed, or that you've crossed your arms and you're starting to posture because you're starting to get frustrated with somebody because they're talking to you, and it may be the tone of the voice you don't like or what they're saying you don't like, but you've been irritated. Maybe you've slightly shifted so that now you're more in a fighting stance, or you squared off to them, whereas before you weren't. Maybe you're starting to feel tension in your stomach, or you're starting to feel constriction in your throat. Maybe it's becoming more difficult for you to talk. Whatever the physiology is, you want to become more sensitized to that. Most of the time, it's later on in the day, or even a week later, when we're still ruminating about it, when we're still stewing about that conversation that had a week ago, that we recognize that we are completely upset, right? Mm. That our whole physiology is, out of whack. We're very stressed out by it. But if we can gain perspective of that at the very beginning stages of when we're first starting to be triggered, we can have more control of the outcome instead of sabotaging ourselves. The second one then is to identify the origin and to ask ourselves, why am I feeling like this? Why do I feel the need to cross my arms? What is it about what they said that has me triggered? So I know I'm triggered, but what is it about what they said that made me triggered?
Okay.
And this question is really designed to help us to track the origin of the emotion that created the trigger. Because here's the thing, while we're being emotionally triggered in the actual present moment, the feelings that you are feeling are tied to an emotional situation that happened to you in the past. Yeah. And I'll give an example of myself that's going to help to kind of frame all this up for you in just a moment. But let me go into tip number 3. Tip number 3 is to understand that our emotional response, our self-sabotaging behavior, is typically a default response, but is one that we can change. We created a habit, right? We created this habit of thought, which then created this habit of action. My habit of thought is, I'm going to be vulnerable, but if you're going to not make me feel safe, then my habit of action is going to be to lash out so that I'm going to make myself feel safe. Okay? So when you change your habit of thought, you change your experiences. Your thoughts and words control your feelings control your actions, and your actions, of course, control your experiences. So by realizing that your mind is your biggest con artist, you can then interrupt the pattern of thought. And this is the best part about tip number 3. You actually thank your sabotaging behaviors. You demonstrate empathy towards your sabotaging behavior because you start to recognize that your sabotaging behavior was born out of trying to make you feel loved, to feel safe, and to belong. Okay? And what you're going to do is, before you respond, before you actually take action, so you've recognized that you're irritated, okay, you recognize that you've got feelings that are because of past situations that have happened to you, you can go ahead and stop and thank the sabotaging behavior before you actually enact it. So you come up with your own statement that really appreciates those sabotaging behaviors by thanking them and telling them to go away. So you're recognizing that they are default coping mechanisms that no longer serve you, and you express gratitude. So you're not criticizing yourself. You're not saying, I'm so stupid for wanting to lash out. You're like, thank you. Thank you for telling me that I should lash out in order to try and make me feel safe, because I know that right now I feel vulnerable. But I'm going to choose to do something else instead. So here's a pattern interrupt statement that I would use. Thank you for trying to talk me into lashing out. I recognize that you are trying to make me feel safe. Still, I have alternative solutions to address my emotional needs. That's key. So you can leave now, know that I am safe without you. Because remember, our self-sabotaging behaviors, for the most part, were born when we were younger and we didn't have the same controls that we have right now. If Scott and I got into an argument as an adult, I can walk away from the situation. If I was a young child, I may not feel capable of being able to walk away. So I would have come up with other tactics in order to make myself feel safe. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Definitely.
And then final tip, okay? And then we can definitely go into more detail and talk about this. But once we've interrupted that pattern, we really want to then create a list of alternative solutions, right? Because you got to fill the gap. You recognize that you've got this default negative coping mechanism, in my case, lashing out, but I need to have a different tool that I can use right away in the moment. So what you can do is you create a list by asking yourself the same question a couple of times. When feeling slightly emotionally triggered or frustrated, what can you do? And my list includes, I can walk away from the situation, I can take a bath, I can go for a walk. Nature is really good for me to try and, recalibrate and kind of move back into my parasympathetic nervous system. You would ask the same question again, but you would say, when feeling moderately triggered, what can I do? I can walk away, so there's the trend there. I can go for a walk, or I can call a friend. And one of the benefits about calling a friend, the secret sauce, is that it actually helps you to dial down the intensity of your emotions. Because what you're having to do is you're having to formulate what happened in your mind. You're having then to articulate your feelings, and then you say them out loud, and you hear yourself say them. And when you do that, you're able to create a little bit more sense of reality around it. Well, did this really happen?
Right.
And when you do that, you start to dial down your emotions around it. And then ask yourself the question again, when feeling very emotionally triggered, what can I do instead of whatever my default sabotage behavior is? Again, I can go for a walk. I can call a support person. And that's not the same thing as a friend. A support person is a coach, a therapist, a hypnotherapist, somebody who's trained that can ask really great questions that allows you to become more reflective, insightful, and really gain clarity as to what your emotions are, where they came from, and what your next steps could be, right? That are healthy. And then obviously go for a walk. So you want to create your own list And you want to start using those tools so that if ever you do get emotionally charged to the point where you do want to enact that default self-sabotage behavior, you've already started practicing some of these other tools, which makes it a little bit easier for then you to go ahead and swap in this new healthy alternative.
It's like reprogramming the computer and replacing one negative habit with a positive one, or more positive ones.
Yeah. And it's like flexing that muscle, right? The more that you and I go to the gym at 6 o'clock in the morning, the more accustomed you become to going to the gym at 6 o'clock in the morning. It just becomes easier. It's not easy, but it becomes easier.
Right, makes sense.
What is interesting when you talked about, and I think it's so helpful, and I thank you for going through all those 4 points, how to become more cognizant of how we feel, why we respond in this certain way. But remember, I had that question about forgiveness. And so, because avoiding conflicts is in a way is very misguiding people, because they feel like, especially as people, believers, no, you have to forgive, and that makes people believe that they need to be in any situation peacemakers and avoid conflicts, forgetting that conflicts is a clear way to resolve the situation. So what I hear from you is, when you are mindful about of like how you respond to certain situations, how you respond to certain triggers and people, and so sometimes, and that's why you gave us different ways of how to respond in situations that are not good for us. So, but without self-sabotaging ourselves when we avoid the conflict. So am I right that avoiding conflict is also a form of self-sabotage, when we have a tendency to constantly forgive and constantly avoid any confrontation?
Yeah, I mean, I think forgiveness and avoiding conflict are kind of two separate things. And again, this is just my opinion. But when we avoid conflict, have you ever noticed that sometimes somebody will avoid conflict, but later they'll blow up?
Yes, exactly.
Right. They accept it. They accept it. They don't want to tell you how they feel. They don't want to tell you that they think that you're wrong, but eventually it comes out anyways.
Of course, yeah.
I don't know that by them avoiding conflict, it's so much so that they're forgiving the event or circumstances that took place. I just think that they're just choosing to dismiss it altogether, or deflect it, or just they're choosing not to respond to it. Forgiveness, though, I think, in the context of my presentation, forgiveness in this case is really about forgiving ourselves for our self-sabotaging behaviors, in that we just need to recognize that those were coping mechanisms that were born out of necessity to make us feel safe, to belong, and to feel loved. And that now that we're older and more cognizant of our own capabilities, we now can choose new, healthier coping mechanisms instead. But without the criticism, without the judgment, without the self-loathing and self-deprecation, of the regret and the shame in enacting those self-sabotaging behaviors, because they happened. All we can do is move forward and become more aware and more perceptive of how we're going to respond anytime we feel triggered.
Okay, so even when we recognize that we are self-sabotaging ourselves, it's just forgiving ourselves and just moving on, rather than dwelling on that sense of like brewing, like, oh, again I did that, I did not wake up when I planned, and again I do self-sabotage, but instead just moving on and forgiving our kind of failures, correct?
Yeah, it's, remember, the self-sabotaging behavior, in the end, it only hurts us. So it's recognizing that part of us, that although it's hurting us, that wasn't its initial intention. Its initial intention was always to protect us. And so it's just saying, I get that you were trying to protect me, but I'm lonely. I want relationships. I want to find my soulmate, and I don't want that soulmate, to be somebody who's narcissistic, or, who's abusive, or whatever, or, I want a social life. I miss going out with people, so thank you, part of me that that tried to keep me isolated because you were afraid, that you were trying to keep me safe from going out and maybe embarrassing myself.
Yeah.
But I need the connection with other people, so I'm going to do it anyways. And if I get embarrassed while I'm out there, I have enough strategies now that I can use. You
That's
know?
wonderful. Yeah, that's very helpful. So, any
Yeah.
questions before we conclude our postcard today? Kristy, that was so informative and so helpful. And it's a new topic because we talked about different triggers and we talked about different coping mechanisms, but self-sabotaging that you just kind of brought us today and
Right.
in details help us to understand. I think we never done that. Thank you. That's kind of a very new podcast for us. So, Candy, Scott, any thoughts?
Lots of things to think about now. Thank you. That was very informative. And I'm just,
Very.
it's just running through my head right now. You can probably see that. Thank you
Yeah.
very much for your time.
Thank you
Yeah.
so much.
Appreciate it. Very
Kristy, there
helpful.
was actually a couple moments where I felt like, ooh, she's getting too close.
She's inside my head.
Right, she
No.
isn't. Yes, absolutely. Thank you. Thank you. Have a wonderful evening, and we wish you the best. And thank you, Candy and Scott, for being with us today. We are
Nice
Coping
to
Life
meet you,
Talk.
Kristy.
Thank you. And we will see you next week. Bye.
Bye.